My name is Josie Butler. I am the Interpretation and Programs Manager here, and it's my honor and privilege to introduce our speaker this morning. Now, everyone in this room knows who our speaker is. You know all of his accolades. You know all about Bud Robertson. There's not a whole lot I can say other than to tell you a little bit about why I feel it is such an honor and a privilege for me to introduce him. Way back when the dinosaurs roamed the earth, Bud Robertson did a 3-week summer seminar in Appomattox for graduate students, and he kept having this high school kid sneak into his class. And he finally looked at me and he said, "You're that interested in Civil War history?" I said, "Yes, sir." And he gave me this book, first book he gave me. It says, "Read this, learn from it, and do it right the next time." Okay? This is his report to Congress on the Civil War centennial. And I opened the book, and I realized what a wicked sense of humor this man had. The book is backwards and upside down. And so this has become the most treasured book in my collection. And Rick, he's the start of my collection. He'll talk to you about that later. Then he brought in another gentleman by the name of Ambler Johnston. And Uncle Ambler gave me a book. And then he gave me a second book. So these are the second and third treasures of my collection that were written by Uncle Ambler Johnston. Through the years, we've had a good friendship, off and on, long time without seeing each other. But have you ever had a friend that you don't see for a long time, and then you pick up where you left off? Well, that's what happened about 3-4 years ago. We came back in touch with each other, and it was like we hadn't been apart for a long, long time. So it is my privilege to introduce not only my mentor. I actually went through the Civil War seminar legally later. But most of all, my good friend, Bud Robertson.
Thank you. Josie mentioned J. Ambler Johnston, and unless you're connected with Virginia Tech, you would not have any idea who he was. But he was my second father, literally my second father. We got to know one another in the Centennial. He headed up the Richmond Civil War Centennial Committee, which was probably the most active local committee in the nation. They just did an enormous amount of good. And he did not know that 2 years after the Centennial ended, in 1967, I came to Virginia Tech, of which he was a graduate. Indeed, Uncle Ambler designed the Tech campus. And our largest dormitory at Virginia Tech is named for him. And it's a co-ed dorm, about 8 floors with a lounge in between each floor. It's like an H. And Dr. Marshall Hahn, the president, was a little hesitant to talk to him about it because Dr. Hahn wanted to make it a co-ed dorm. And Uncle Ambler, of course, was born class of 1901. He was a little dated, to say the least. And Dr. Hahn called Uncle Ambler and said, and everybody called him Uncle Ambler at Virginia Tech, said, "Uncle Ambler, we'd love for you to come up. Are you in favor? Do you object to us naming a co-ed dorm after you?" And he said, "No, why can I sign up for a room?" and I think one of the funniest moments of my life came at the dedication. Uncle Ambler was only about this tall. His father had been in the Salem Flying Artillery. And at the dedication, he got up to speak, and they were all members of his family. And he was just wonderfully blunt. And he began to introduce his family. "This is my nephew, John Jones. He's an alcoholic, but we're working as best we can." Then he went over, "And this is my niece, Jenny. She's been married 3 times, and I wish she'd settle down." And went on down the line, and it was just absolutely hilarious. But the funniest thing occurred with Bruce Catton. And many of you have heard of Bruce. He gave the keynote address here in 1965. I sat at his feet. He was a member of the National Commission. We were very close friends, and He taught me a lot about writing times when we were traveling together. And he once wrote Uncle Ambler, and he said, "Dear Mr. Johnston, I'm writing a 3-volume history of the Civil War. Will you tell me what you think of General William T. Sherman?" And Uncle Ambler simply wrote down at the bottom of the letter and mailed it back, and he wrote, "Dear Mr. Catton, I try never to think of this son of a bitch." So he was just a wonderful guy. He really was. And I want to thank Josie for mentioning it, and it's great to see all you all again. And again, I want to commend the Jamesons for their hospitality and for much of this building was their doing, and we will all be eternally grateful to them. I'm going to do something now. I'm going to jump out of the Civil War because we're about to leave the Civil War. This is one of the last events that will occur during the sesquicentennial, and I was talking to a group of reenactors yesterday, and I hadn't thought of it until they reminded me this is about the last reenactment we will ever see. There's nothing to reenact now with the end of the war. But to be perfectly honest with you, I have never thought of Appomattox as the end of the Civil War. I think it was the beginning of the end of the Civil War. We would have to travel a long, long journey to get to the end of it. And in that regards, the National Geographic Society called me 2 years ago and asked me if I would do a second book for them, and they wanted to do a book on what happened to the leading figures after the Civil War. Well, at the time, that had absolutely no appeal whatsoever to me, and I just said, no, I'm not interested in. And that in itself was unique. You just don't say no to the National Geographic Society if you're a writer, but I just didn't particularly care to think about it. And then 2 of my first cousins and their wives came to spend a weekend with us at our home on the Potomac, and the subject came up, and this was months later. And then both of my cousins said, "How could you turn down something like that?" And I spent the weekend not only being host, but meditating over this invitation. And so Monday morning I called Lisa Thomas, who's the senior editor at NGS, and I said, "Is the invitation still open?" And she said it was. So this fall I have a book coming out, and it's called After the Civil War, in which I take about 70 individuals, not only generals and political leaders, but other folks like Matthew Brady and Jonathan Letterman and whatnot, and I tell you what happened to them after the war. And it's amazing, it's extraordinary, and in some cases it's bizarre, absolutely bizarre. Most of you know who Montgomery Meigs was, the Union Quartermaster General, an incredible individual. Apparently he was petrified by water, scared to death of water. He decreed in his will that when his body was put in the coffin, his head would be encased in cement. What difference did it make at that time? And were you to exhume his body now from Arlington National Cemetery, all you'd find is that cement block with his head in it somewhere or other. And Matthew Brady, the father of modern-day photography, died homeless on the streets of New York and was buried in an unmarked grave for 20 years. So it's an exciting book, and it's coming out this fall. And it's not a coffee table book like The Untold Civil War, but I hope you'll enjoy it. I hope you'll want to read about what happened thereafter. And I give talks on it, the PowerPoint talks on the book, and I entitled it Whatever Happened To, and with a question mark, and point out these men and some of the and crazy things that go on. But Appomattox is the beginning of the end. There was a lot of things to do. Now that we can look back with some degree of retrospect, General Lee and General Grant arranged surrender terms here at Appomattox. But it wasn't the surrender of the South to the North. It was the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia to the Army of the Potomac. Generals fight a war, but they do not dictate the peace. Politicians tell us when the war is over. And further, the same industrial forces that propel the Union Army to victory would expand and elbow its way to world power. Thomas Jefferson's long-beloved vision of a nation of farmers evaporates during the Civil War, and the nation shifts over and enters the field of industry. And in a short period of 35 years, 1865 to 1900, American industrialization becomes the leader of the world in 35 years. A whole new generation of men, most of whom were absolutely unknown in the Civil War, become America's first millionaires, in one case, America's first billionaire. And I'll be mentioning them momentarily. But a number of Civil War figures had a personal role in influencing the future, and their impact showed both in expected ways, such as how the Union government treated the South after the war, and it had its effect on unexpected ways. Anybody ever heard of James Hanger? He was from Stanton. He was in the first battle of the Civil War, the Battle of Philippi, or whatever. West Virginians call it all kinds of things, but West Virginians call it. But at Philippi, which was fought in June 1861, James Hanger had been in service 2 days when the Federals surprised a little Confederate force there along the creek, and one of the first artillery shells took off Hanger's leg. He was captured. A surgeon removed, straightened out the amputated limb, and he went home, hobbled home to Stanton. And he was a cabinet maker, really, by hobby as much as about anything else. And so he locked himself in his upstairs bedroom, and he kept calling for wood and rubber and hinges, etc. And then one morning, as the Hanger family was gathered for breakfast, they heard this clumping coming down the steps. And here was James Hanger, not wearing a peg leg, but wearing a leg he had shaped with hinges at the knees and the ankles. He is the father of American prosthetics. And the Hanger Corporation today, and I checked on the internet to verify this, makes 700,000 artificial limbs a year. And it all goes back to a teenager who was not going to use a peg leg. It's just one of many post-war things that take place. So in many ways, the forge of war did shape private lives as well as the collective life of the nation. Now, Abraham Lincoln, of course, had hoped for a peace with malice toward none and charity for all. That would not come to pass. And we have to face that when we come up on the commemorative services that will be held in the years yet to come. And that just simply would not occur. Lee and Grant waged a bad war, and hoped to have a good peace. That was not to be. It was not to be because well, you start with Andrew Johnson. You can pick many factors, but Andrew Johnson is a pathetic case. He was a square peg trying to fit into a round hole. He was selected in 1864 to be Lincoln's running mate. Lincoln was convinced in 64, by the autumn 64, that the North would win, but he wanted to ensure this, and so he did an absurd thing in the eyes of politicians today. He picked a Democrat from the South to be his running mate. And so Andrew Johnson was chosen. He was then the military governor of federally controlled Tennessee. And suddenly on April 15th, 1865, Andrew Johnson finds himself president of the United States. He had made a fool of himself at the inauguration in March. He had had a cold. He was nervous about taking the inaugural oath at the Senate, so he had a couple of Hummers. And when you remember the fact, if you accept the fact that the average bourbon of that day was 180 proof, it's about 2 steps short of embalming fluid. And so Johnson had had a couple of Hummers before the oath, and he was bombed when he got up there, and he began to talk incoherently, and he had made a fool of himself at the inauguration, which immediately alienated all the members of Congress. So that when Andrew Johnson became president, the Congress just chose to ignore him. He was a man without a country, a party, or without friends. But he was also probably the most poverty-ridden person we've ever had in the White House. He was poor. He came from poorer backgrounds than Abraham Lincoln. He did not even know how to read and write when he was married, and his wife taught him the basic fundamentals of how you add numbers and read languages. And Johnson, however, was stubborn, outspoken, etc., and he immediately comes into contact, almost physical contact, with the radical Republicans. They were not large in number, but they were totally large in influence. If you were a Republican leader after the war, you belonged to the radicals. Now, why are they called radicals? One, they wanted slavery abolished instantly and steps taken in the direction of equality. And in that unsettled time when you're just getting over a war, that was not the kind of thing that you wanted to do. Secondly, the radical Republicans believed that the South needed to pay for its sins of secession, that the peace negotiated by Grant and Lee was not good enough. The South must pay for it. And so in March of 1867, the Congress passed the Military Reconstruction Act. Johnson vetoed it. The Congress overrode his veto in the same day. And for the first time, Americans were put under military occupation. Now, we have revisionist historians out there today, and I'm not going to get into a debate with them. But there are revisionists who say that Robert E. Lee was angry after the war, that he just would not accept defeat gracefully. I deny that strongly. I would humbly submit that Robert E. Lee did more for the reconciliation of this nation than any man alive between 1865 and 1870. And so Lee did get angry with the passage of the Reconstruction Act by which the South was placed under martial law. Why? Because it repudiated Grant's promise to him at Appomattox that all the Confederates could go home. And as long as they behaved themselves, they would not be subjected to any pressure from the Union. And what made Lee so angry was that U.S. Grant presided over this Reconstruction. Grant knowingly broke his word. Well, you have to kind of remember what Grant was. And he was a totally military man. And at the end of the Civil War, he was a hero of the hour, the national hero. He like Washington, had saved the Union and the country was complete. And Grant expected to be nominated for president. And he expected to win, which he did in 1868. But at the same time, Grant knew absolutely nothing about the presidency. He really didn't have any desire to learn anything about it. He's remembered for one phrase, "Let us have peace," when he initiated an age of hate during the Reconstruction. And his 2 terms in the White House were 8 years of blunderland. We've never had as much scandal and whatnot, despite recent attempts to equal it. We have never had as much scandal. 3 cabinet members were dead guilty of embezzlement, thievery, and crookedness, and they included his Secretary of the Interior, and he resigned to escape being put in prison. So his 8 years in the White House were a blunderland. Now, what does this mean? It means that after the war, we have no president. The Congress is governing the country, and you're under the control of radical abolitionists led by Thaddeus Stevens from Pennsylvania and Charles Sumner from Massachusetts. Tommy Lee Jones portrayed Thaddeus Stevens in Spielberg's movie, and he did well, except they should have cast somebody else like Danny DeVito, really, to match Stevens' size. He was a short little man. He barely weighed 100 pounds. He was born with a terrible club foot, and which straggled around. And he purposefully wore an ill-fitting wig that was always out of place. It slopped around on one side of his head. And one lady visitor to the Congress once had said how much she admired his hair, and he took his wig off and said, "Keep it." If he ever smiled, history does not record it. And Stevens was vindictive. He wanted people hanged. He actually wanted Lee and Davis to be sent to the gallows. Massive executions taken, made so that the South never again would misbehave. And so Congress is going to rule the country for 10 critical years during the Johnson and Grant administrations. And it's going to be a wild time, if you can imagine, if Congress had a free hand today, just what chaos that would be when the Congress is so dysfunctional they can't even attend to the crises we have, much less look to the past. Consequently, it continues to make mistakes, not knowing the past. It continues to wander from one blunder to another. And so after this military reconstruction ends in 1877, and it was the first act of the new president, Rutherford B. Hayes. And Hayes was a likable, honest guy, but the 76 election is the most rigged one in American history. Samuel Tilden far outpolled Hayes by popular vote, but they had to do some compromising with the electoral votes, and Hayes ended up as president. So Robert E. Lee's pleas for his fellow countrymen to help bind the nation's wounds fell on many deaf ears, and the South responded to Reconstruction by developing a cult. It's called the Lost Cause, and it still exists today. Fortunately, it's declining, but it still exists. And the basic tenets of the Lost Cause was, one, we were overwhelmed by superior numbers. That's why we lost. Two, the South had a more justifiable cause. It was fighting for freedom, not for a tenuous Union. And three, we had Robert E. Lee on our side. You put those three together, and Southerners reacted sharply. And one of them, the leader of this pack, was probably General Jubal Early, who was, he's a fascinating character. He was a bachelor. He fathered a number of children, but he was a bachelor, crippled early in manhood by arthritis, which kept him bent and in pain constantly. He cursed like a sailor, and chewed tobacco, not normally. He put a quid in each jaw, and each jaw full, and he really didn't bother to spit. He kind of, so he just drooled all over him. He was the only general who cursed in the presence of Robert E. Lee. And Lee once said something to the effect, "This is my dirty old man." And this is where the phrase seems to have originated. But Early would lead the fight, and he would take on anybody, any Southern hero who had gone over to the Northern cause on the Northern side with the Republicans for any reason, came under his wrath. And his outlet, as my dear friend John Koski knows, were the Southern Historical Society papers, monthly paper, a monthly journal put out that extolled all that the South had done. It was the printed record of the lost cause. And Early decided to take on the worst villain, the worst Southern scalawag that he could find, General James Longstreet, who had married Grant's first cousin. And so Longstreet had appealed to Grant after the war, and Longstreet went over easily into the Republican ranks, and that doomed him. And Longstreet becomes the great goat of it. And still we argue, if only Longstreet had come up on the second day of Gettysburg, the course of history would have been changed. Well, that's called faction. It's neither fact nor fiction, but it's if thing. It keeps Civil War roundtables alive. I'm talking about the ifs of the Civil War. And then before long, one of the most noted of Virginians went over to the cause. John Mosby used his friendship with Grant to get an ambassadorial job. And Mosby was outlawed by the South in print. So politics is going to stumble and bumble, and in the last 35 years of the war, we've got mediocrities in the South, in the presidency. Nobody stands out. But of course, nobody could stand out after the martyred Lincoln. Anyone is going to pale in comparison. Johnson was a flat failure. He's regarded as next to the worst of our presidents, the worst being James Buchanan, who simply stared on a comatose stage and watched the nation fall apart. But Grant is rated close to the bottom of the pack. We would love to remember him only as a general, but we can't forget him for what he did or didn't do as president. Now, the Civil War would cast a long shadow over future warfare as well. The advent of the rifle occurred years before the Civil War, but the rifle came into massive use during the Civil War. And the advantage of the rifle, and this is for you ladies who wonder about guns in the Civil War, the rifle is called the rifle because inside the rifle barrel is a grooved edge. And so you put a bullet in there with the bullet stretched out at the back, and you fire it, and the bullet comes out spinning, which increases its range enormously. The old musket fired in baseball terms a knuckleball, which just came out this way. It's going to hit somewhere over in that direction. Terrible range, terrible accuracy for a little round ball, but that bullet has a spin to it. And whereas the musket ball was effective for 80 yards, the bullet is a killer at 400 yards. In old days, you could make a charge against the musket, and the defenders could get in maybe 2 shots before they were overwhelmed. You could come up to 100 yards, get ready, and then charge the 100 yards. You can't do that with the bullet, with the rifle. And you've got to come from a quarter of a mile away, and the defense will get in about 5 or 6 shots. They will blow an attacking column to pieces. And that's one of the great firsts of the Civil War. For the first time, the advantage in war goes to the defense, thanks to the rifle. And then there was a fellow named Christopher Spencer, who said, I could do better than that single-firing musket kind of thing. And Christopher Spencer invented the Spencer carbine, the 7-shot carbine, which is much like the Winchester today. You put 7 shots into the chamber, and all you had to do was fire and click, fire and click. And Confederates claimed the damn thing was a weak gun, W-E-E-K. You loaded it on Sunday and fired it all week. And it was absolutely deadly against the charging column. You see, one man has a firepower of 5 when it comes to an attacking column. And then there was Brother George Gatling, Richard Gatling, excuse me. Gatling was an inventor, and he came to the belief that if he could invent a weapon so terrible that people would not fight, then it would end all wars. And so Gatling conceived of an idea of not a 1-barrel thing, but a 6-barrel gun. And you put the bullets into it, and you just crank the screw. This thing went tut-tut-tut-tut-tut-tut-tut, and the Gatling gun what came into being. It was not effective in the Civil War. It had a multitude of problems, but they kept working on it. And it is after the Civil War the Gatling gun was developed, and it just eradicated the Indians in the West. It just tore tribes to pieces. And that thing is going. And Gatling did not achieve his aim. The wars went on, and by his invention, he simply increased the killing power. And the Gatling gun lives today. It is probably the most infernal airborne weapon in the world. And one airplane has it, the A-10 Warthog. And that plane is built around a nose gun with 7 barrels in it. And you have to listen carefully. Those 7 barrels can fire 3,900 armor-piercing bullets a minute when they come in. And in Afghanistan and elsewhere, the enemy knows what the Americans are, but they are scared to death of a Warthog because it can strafe and clean out an area very, very quickly. Sherman, of course, is known as the father of total war. He was a man who believed that it is not the Southern armies we have to beat, it's the Southern will to resist that we have to conquer. And he knew this out of his love for the South. Sherman spent years in the South. He was superintendent of the Louisiana Military Academy, and as such, he was the father of Louisiana State University. And he went to St. Louis in 1860 to take charge of the city's streetcar system. And he hated to leave the South. And after the war, believe it or not, General Sherman was invited often to come into the South and speak. He was one of the South's better speakers. You see, the image we have of Sherman as a horrible psychopath today really began around 1930. Until then, he was regarded as a brilliant general who introduced the total war and really shortened the killing by the advances he made. And today, I think he needs a better press than he gets. Nathan Bedford Forrest, the greatest cavalryman of the war, introduced these quick strike things in which Forrest horsemen would gallop quick, long distance quickly. They would reach the objective, dismount, fight on foot, jump back on the horses, and gallop back to safety. A quick strike kind of offense. We saw this in World War II. The German Blitzkrieg was simply Nathan Bedford Forrest brought up to date. The war also brought major advances in the field of medicine. And one of the leading figures in the book I've done is Dr. Jonathan Letterman. Here is a man who literally saved thousands of lives. He was an Army. His father had been a surgeon. He devoted himself to Army service. In 1862, McClellan appointed Letterman as medical director of the Army of the Potomac and gave him carte blanche. McClellan said, you do everything you have to do. Well, the first thing he did was tell the quartermaster department to go to hell, because he was dependent on them for wagons, and wagons for the medical corps were very low on the quartermaster list. And so many would say his greatest contribution was the establishment of an ambulance corps. Ambulance wagons specifically designed to take 9 wounded men at a time. And Letterman's belief was the quicker we can get to them, the better we can treat them, the more lives we could save. And he created this rotation. As the guns stopped firing, the ambulances were on the field. The Teamsters were not ignorant whites or ex-slaves. The Teamsters were medically trained to give first aid, immediate first aid to the victims. And so one can say, among other things, Letterman was the father of EMT, emergency service thing we have today when you call 911 and they come to get you. But Letterman invented all kinds of things. He set up 3 stages of hospital on the field for quick service. Back behind the field is the battle hospital, and you move the more seriously wounded in time to general hospitals in the city. And this went on and on and on. And the best example I can give you of Letterman's dedication was to compare 2 battles. In April 1862 was fought the Great Battle of Shiloh out in southwestern Tennessee. The battle occurred on Friday and Saturday. As late as the following Wednesday, nobody had been on that field, so that untold numbers have died of hemorrhage, shock, and the like, lying on the field. On July 5th, 1863, at Gettysburg, the Union wounded to the last man had been cleared from the fields. They were at first aid stations or en route by train to the hospitals in Washington. Jonathan Letterman is a miracle man in the Civil War, and the only reminder we have of him was Letterman General Hospital in San Francisco, and it has ceased to be that. And he himself had a sad life. He was a long-time bachelor serving in the West. Frontier guard duties didn't give him much opportunity to romance. After the Battle of Antietam, he was a house guest of a couple in Western Maryland, and they had a daughter, and they were married. Letterman married her. After the war, he resigned in 1864. Federal bureaucracy just got too much for him. He wasn't paying attention to regulations. He did what he thought he humanely should do. So he left the Army in 64, became the coroner of San Francisco, and suddenly in 1869, his wife, his bride of 6 years, died, and he was left with 2 infant children, and the situation was such he couldn't care for them. He had to give the children to families back on the East Coast around Baltimore. So he lost his whole family, and he just never got over it. He died of a broken heart at the age of 46. And it's just a terrible way for a brilliant man to go. The best testimonial I can make to him came from Major General Paul Hawley, who was medical director of the Allied forces that invaded Europe. And in 1945, Hawley commented, "There has not been a day in my life during this war that I have not given thanks to God for Jonathan Letterman, who set the standards for military care." So Letterman is in there. And let's go back to Montgomery Meigs for a moment. He's the greatest quartermaster general we ever had. He's the first American ever entrusted with spending $1 billion. And he did spend $1 billion. What is incredible is he could account for every penny of it. Go to the Pentagon today and ask for financial summaries or something. But Montgomery Meigs could account for every penny he spent. And he completed the construction of the U.S. Capitol building. He was a very humorless man. He had no sense of humor, and people just didn't like him. He regarded all Confederates as traitors who ought to be hanged. And this was because he and Robert E. Lee had been such close friends for 30 years. And he turned against Lee. He turned against his own brother who served in the Confederacy. And so nobody liked him. And in about 1880, Meigs built the pension building in Washington. It was a red monstrosity. I don't know if it's still standing or not. But the general-in-chief at that time was Philip Sheridan. And Meigs proudly gave him a tour of the red building. And Sheridan, very candid. He then asked Sheridan, "What do you think of it?" and showed him reply. There's one thing I dislike about it, unfortunately, it's fireproof. And I don't think Meigs understood that, what he was singing. The Civil War was likewise the greatest media event in American history. The media had its field day. This is the first time all of America's media ever concentrated on one thing. Correspondents poured out, field correspondents who traveled with the armies and sent dispatches back home. And they were no more accurate then than they are now. You know, I just went through a terrifying ordeal of getting Virginia a state song. And I started in January, taking it through the chain of command, the House Rules Committee of the House, the Senate Rules Committee. My first venture into politics, so help me God, that's my last venture into politics. It's not so much that the legislatures was unkind, it's what the newspapers do. They just excoriated me. I was simply trying to do a favor. We hadn't had a state song in 18 years. And I asked Speaker of the House, Bill Howell, and President Pro Tem of the Senate, Chuck Hogan, if they minded if I tried to get us a state song, so I proceeded to do so. And it just swept through the general legislature. But in the process, not a single newspaper in the state endorsed it. You know, which really hurt. And some of them just played insults and made outright lies. We Americans are gullible. We believe that if it's in print, it's true. It's not. Take my word, it is not. And those papers manufacture news. They use editorial opinion and pass it off as fact. It was a horrible ordeal. And as my wife Betty and I know, we watched the proceedings of the House and the Senate, and we were unsure till the very end if this thing was going to last. Because suddenly it starts off with one song nominated and a dozen others come out of the walls. The wannabes just poured for it. But I'm proud to say it passed the House of Delegates 82-15. It passed the Senate 37-1. And the governor signed it into law March the 26th. So starting in July, we will have a new state song. My insistence from the very beginning was that the melody was non-debatable. We were going to use the melody that is Virginia's most famous folk song, and the melody is Shenandoah. And this afternoon, the Appomattox Choral Group will be here at a 1 o'clock concert, and our last song will be the first public play of our new state song. I hope you'll be here to hear it. We just was lucky to get a lyricist. God, he's just an incredible human being. He wrote the words for the song used at the Sandy Hook Elementary School commemoration, Sleep Sweet Angels. And when Mike Greenley and I were talking, I think it was about our second or third conversation, he said, well, what do you want that song to be? And I said, I want it to be inspirational. And it's a beautiful song. I hope you'll enjoy this afternoon. So, but it's this award that gives rise to a number of artists. Homer Winslow, the great painter of the sea, began his start making battlefield sketches. Alfred Wall, the WAUD, probably was the most prolific of the sketchers. And Thomas Nast, the father of editorial page cartoons, made tremendously propagandistic drawings. Anyone else know what Thomas Nast drew? Santa Claus. The fact that we have Santa Claus at Christmas time originated with Nast in 1862. You get into the field of nursing, you're going to run into individuals who are immortal in American literature. Louisa May Alcott and Walt Whitman both served as nurses, both wrote memoirs of their service in the war. And as the war ended, suddenly national attention turned toward the unspoiled West. And thousands of Americans headed west with the sunset in search of gold and silver and pasture land. And while some of the army commanders out there blundered, at the top of the list incontestably has to be George Custer, who practically deserved what he got. I hate to say that, but he was out to slaughter Indians, and he got slaughtered himself. And the National Geographic Society did a special on the Little Bighorn not too long ago. I don't know if you saw it or not, but it put to rest forever after the Custer's last stand. There was no last stand. He galloped in, and the Indians struck him from three sides. Custer's men were using single-shot rifles. Many of the Indians were armed with Spencer carbines. The Indians outnumbered the soldiers by about 10-1, it was a slaughter. And they found bodies stretched over a 3-mile area. Custer never had time to make a last stand. So that myth has to go to rest. And of course, as the West was being settled, you got the crazy people. There's an era of lawlessness there, where the best shooter rules the town, and the sheriff stands halfway between a lawman and a murderer. And so this is where you get all your gunmen, the gunslingers, come out there. And I have an article on Wild Bill Hickok, who was really the creation of a newspaper correspondent. He was a local drunk and a gambler. He served as sheriff, and he didn't bother to arrest people. He just shot them. And the first story that pops up about him, he was marshal of some little town, and he had a shootout with the infamous McKinley brothers. And apparently there were 10 of them, and Hickok took them on in the middle of Main Street and shot them all, and emerged victorious. Well, as a matter of fact, the McKinleys were farm boys, and they came into town to settle a debt. And Hickok ambushed them. He was hiding behind a barrel and shot them in the back. He actually took out 2 of them, old man McKinley and one of his boys, and he killed 2 passers-by who just got in the line of fire. And Hickok took them on. But he became famous for cross-draw. He wore twin guns backwards, and he was famous for pulling them out and banging away. And this image you have of Marshal Dillon standing in the middle of the street shooting it out with somebody, it's just pure fabrication. They ambushed them anytime they could. They were ambushing. And if you were having a shootout in the open, you didn't stand this way, you stood this way and fired. You were less of a target. And I think Hickok was mayor of Dodge City in 1881 when in a shootout, he shot his own deputy in the stomach and killed him. And with that, he just becomes a roving gambler, moving from place to place. And if you saw the TV series Deadwood, he pops up there. One of the key characters plays Wild Bill Hickok, and appropriately, Hickok was killed when a guy walked up behind him at a poker game and shot him in the back of the head. This was quite typical of the Old West. But then you've got an era, too, where we're going to have the appearance of the industrial giants. These men are coming forward and making tremendous funds, and making fortunes never before imagined in this young country. Andrew Carnegie, who was the great iron manufacturer, went abroad to get new ideas. He ran into a fellow named Henry Bessemer, who had invented a process where you could refine iron and make it into steel. Carnegie came back and put Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on the map. He was America's first millionaire. And he took wartime opportunities to push his ironworks and to profit therefrom thereafter. And then there was Jay Gould, G-O-U-L-D, who's a great railroad magnate. He was a speculator who bought up stocks. And at one time, he owned 15 of the nation's major railroads. John D. Rockefeller came forward. He would be the first of the millionaires. And his name is associated with oil. But he did not own the oil fields, as you like to think. He was smarter than that. He didn't get that much invested in land. He owned the refineries where you took the crude and refined it. And he came into the business and began to make his fortune just as a contraption called the automobile was coming into being. And his wealth zoomed. He's the first billionaire in American history. At his death in 1937, at the age of 90-something, he was the first billionaire we had. But in his last 40 years, he's remembered most for his charities. And the University of Chicago was one of the gifts he made to the country. Andrew Carnegie got interested in libraries, and there are 9,000 free circulating Carnegie libraries in this country today. Philip Armour got a monopoly of the meat industry with his packing plant in Southside Chicago. And until up to that point, you ate either the pork chop, the bacon, or the ham. But Armour decided that every part of the pig could be used. And so they used bones and whatnot to manufacture fertilizer, glue, all sorts of products of that sort. And as Armour used to like to say, we use everything from the pig but the squeal. And, but he actually goes into notoriety because his operation was so filthy, etc., that early in the 20th century, charges were brought against him. and Alma's influence quite honestly went down. And then that was Clara Barton, a volunteer nurse in the war, who went on in 1867 to establish the American Red Cross, which she did. And she led it for many, many years before being forced out. And then there was Frederick Douglass. And he had been such a success in bringing attention to slavery and abolition and to influencing Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. But after the war, Douglass sort of glides steadily downward, and apathy takes over. And once the war is over, the white folks just don't care what happens to 3.5 million ex-slaves. And Frederick Douglass would spend his last years in a futile effort to keep the abolition going. And civil rights is still active today. That's one part of the journey we have not finished from the Civil War. But Douglass, I would submit, is the grandest voice that black Americans have ever had. He's far more influential than Martin Luther King. Well, the book is filled with delightful characters. We had 4 assassinations in America. 3 of them occurred within about a 40-year period. And you know all about Kennedy's murder. You know all about Lincoln's assassination. But I discuss James Garfield's killing, and that of William McKinley. And I discuss a particular chapter of each one of the assassins. Who would want to kill William McKinley? If you did a poll of popularity in office, McKinley would rank among the top 3. Everybody loved McKinley. He was likable, personable, a war veteran, always for big business, but always with having labor conditions improved at the same time. He loved to go out into public and greet people. At his presidential inauguration in 1897, after saying, "So help me God," he did something he'd never done before. He leaned over and kissed his mother. If a president were to do that today, it would bring national nausea, which is an indictment of us. His wife, Ada, was epileptic. So at White House dinners, she never sat at the far end. She sat beside him. And if she had a seizure, while he was talking, he would gently put a napkin over her face and put his hand on her shoulder and keep on talking until she got through with the seizure. Everybody loved Bill McKinley. But this was a day of anarchy. I think if I have my figures right, in a 9-year period, 7 heads of state were murdered in office, 8 in Europe, and McKinley becomes the 9th. But thanks to Robert E. Lee, thanks to conciliatory figures such as Hayes and William McKinley and Wade Hampton, Lawrence Chamberlain, John B. Gordon, plus a majority of veteran soldiers on both sides of the war would slowly come together. And I was asked yesterday in my group talking about how we came together again. We have the veterans to thank for that. And those of you who have been attending talks, forgive my repetition, but I think it bears keeping it in mind. It is the veterans who bring us together. That's it. There's no other factor more important than the veterans. And they, as the war began to pass and the bitterness began to wane, and Billy Yanks and Johnny Rebs began to think, they came to the same conclusions. They were blessed. They had survived. And along the way, Billy Yanks and Johnny Rebs began to think, he suffered just as much as I did. I had diarrhea, so did he. I was homesick, so was he. I was scared to death, so was he. And suddenly, as author Stephen Crane, who wrote The Red Badge Courage, says, a sort of mystique brotherhood begins to take over with these veterans. And whereas at certain times of battlefield reunions, the North would be over here and the Southern boys would be over there, as the years began to pass, more and more they came together and realized that this one-time difference, i.e. the Civil War, should not be something to impair the future. They could relive in common the horror and the hell through which they had passed. And if I could go back into history, as I said yesterday, and relive a moment, I would love to relive July 3rd, 1938, the 75th reunion, the last reunion was held at Gettysburg. 1,250 veterans with their average age 92. And there's a picture showing a bunch of old Confederates come running across the wheat field at Gettysburg where Pickett made his charge. They're laughing and carrying on because right in front of them, from the photographer's point of view, the Union veterans are cheering them on. And then the moment comes when they get to the stone wall, which was the objective of the attack. A photograph of blue and gray reaching across, shaking hands. And that's the moment I would like to see, because instinctively these men began to weep. They cried at what had been. They cried over comrades who were no longer there. They cried at the blessings they shared by being there. They cried because as friends they could now come back together. And one could say that the nation was born that July afternoon in 1938. And it is strange, really, isn't it? Here we are today, only 150 years later. Most of you are from Virginia, many of you are not. I know there's one very kind gentleman here from Ohio, a couple from Michigan. I've already met two people from Seattle, Washington. And we come together to remember a civil war. It's never happened before. Nations want to forget it. The Russians don't celebrate overthrowing the Tsar or anything of that sort. The English are always chopping heads off of kings. So they don't commemorate anything. But we do. And it's the American nature to do that. We do that such a thing. And I think it's just wonderful that we gather here, not to mark so much an end as a beginning. We are here because of what those men did and what they gave us. They loved their country more than they loved life itself. And I think we must never forget that. We owe them big time, not only in war, but in peace. And I'm often asked, well, why did these men do it? How did they sustain all the horror and whatnot? I can't tell you why, but I think Alfred Hausman came close to the truth when he had a dead soldier say these words from the grave. Here dead lie because we did not choose to live in shame the land from which we sprung. Life, to be sure, is nothing much to lose, but young men think it is, and we were young. Thank you. All right, thank you. We've got a little, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to remember this when I get back home tonight on the Potomac. I've got to leave immediately after the concert this afternoon. The page galleys of a new book awaiting. I've edited, I think, the biggest diary in Civil War history, published in 1866. And it had never been edited. The writer never identified individuals. So it's a 2-volume diary, and the University of Kansas Press is publishing. I have 2,700 footnotes. So I have to start the indexing process when I get back. And indexing is slow. I insist on doing my own indices because I think that's the book's greatest strength is its index. But you, as John Koski and I were talking late this morning, you can't do it very long. You can index for about 45 minutes, and you do it by putting cards that just isolate line by line, and you move down. And I find after about 45 minutes, my mind is wandering. So I stop, and then I'll do something for 15, 20 minutes, and come back and do it some more. So I've got about somewhere around 900 pages to index before this thing is over. And so my work is cut out, but you all have helped make going home and working a sheer pleasure, and I'm deeply grateful for the reception that you've given me. Okay, any questions I can answer? Yes, sir.
The influence of the GAR after the war, the Grand Army of the Republic.
Yeah, the Grand Army of the Republicans, Grand Army of the Republic was founded by Union veterans. Its son became the American Legion later on. But it was a very, very powerful force. In numbers alone, I believe I'm right in saying about 400,000 members. I may be wrong, but it was a large number of members with tremendous political influence. The GAR is a great deal responsible for the monuments we have on battlefields. They were pushing legislature to appropriate funds. The South had an equal organization, the United Confederate Veterans. They were much smaller in number and totally without financial means to try and keep the war going. And this is why on these battlefields you'll see all these monuments to Union forces, but the South just didn't have the money to put up monuments of its own. And you cannot do a battle reenactment on federally owned property, and I'm responsible for that. When I was appointed to the Civil War Centennial Commission after President Kennedy purged it, and I sat in the Oval Office with the President and Allen Nevins, the new chairman, and Kennedy, as I said yesterday, Kennedy might be Camelot in your memory, but he was a Boston Irishman with a short temper, and he belonged in Harry Truman's class for cursing. And Kennedy was just fed up with it, the whole centennial thing. It had become a celebration. It had gotten out of hand. And he said, all right, you gentlemen tell me where to start. I was 31 years old, sitting in the office of the President of the United States. I was so naive, so innocent, that I just popped in. Up and said, Mr. President, I think the first thing you can do to make this thing serious is to stop reenactments on national ground. Those fields at Gettysburg and Antietam are holy ground. They're like a cemetery. The blood of patriots has consecrated it. And he said, you're right, but he had a couple of other words between you and right. And he pushed the buzzer, and his secretary, Mrs. Lincoln, came in, and he issued the presidential decree right then. That no reenactments, no kinds of recreational stuff would ever be held on battle reenactments. So there are some reenactors who look on me as Judas Iscariot, but I wouldn't change my mind for a moment. I find myself on the battlefield talking in a low tone. Sometimes I can't talk when you go on those battlefields. You think of what those young students and clerks and farm boys went off to war naively thinking one battle and it'll be all over. Then they go through 4 years of living hell, dying of all kinds of sicknesses and diseases. The bullets were merciful. Typhoid fever, malaria, measles, infection, God knows. Sepsis was probably one of the major killers, and 2/3 of you have no idea what sepsis is, but you know antiseptics. It's blood poisoning. And I've changed my mind on the death of Stonewall Jackson. That's the one thing I wish I could correct in the book. I don't think he died of pneumonia. And physicians insist he did not either. He died of sepsis. He was shot in the arm. His arm was broken, bleeding. They carried him a mile. They dropped him off the stretcher twice. Both times he fell on that wounded limb, and dragged him over mud and dirt and whatnot. And I mean, it couldn't be anything but sepsis. And the symptoms that occurred thereafter just don't fit pneumonia. The temperature didn't slowly rise. You don't get congestion, have difficulty breathing. These things you have with pneumonia, and I know that I had it twice last year. But the symptoms do follow blood poisoning. So sepsis is going to wipe these guys out. And as I said to a crowd yesterday, and I appreciate your being, those of you who were there yesterday being here, if I could have gone on the battlefield with just two things, I would have been considered a messiah. A box of Band-Aids and a tube of Neosporin. The lives I could have saved with Neosporin and the Band-Aid, stuff we just take for granted. A mosquito bite could be fatal. We all laugh at measles. It's deadly. Measles doesn't pop out here, they pop out in your lungs. And you normally die of pneumonia when you hit with measles. Measles will wipe out 10% of every regiment that goes in the field. 1 out of 10 will die before they ever see action from measles. It's so contagious. They got to the training camp for the first time. These farm boys who'd never been subjected to anything are put in with thousands of men. You're going to catch something. And so a disease erupts. It's an epidemic. And rubiola, the measles, is the easiest, most contagious of the diseases. So 10% of a regiment will go down before it ever sees any action.